Okay, hello, good evening, everyone. I think we should start. My name is Maria Bustelo from the Complutense University at Madrid. I feel really honored to chair this session, the end of the research network on gender politics and the state, RNGS, what's next? And I want to thank all the conveners, and especially Amy Mazur and Dorothy McBride, for asking me to do so, and also to Faith Armitage and Karen Sealis, also for being such good conveners for this wonderful conference. The RNGS project started in 1995, and it has produced crucial pieces for the study of gender and politics, and more concretely for the conceptualization of state feminism, the study of different issues and debates, and the interface between women's movement and women's agencies. Apart from starting with the milestone edition of Comparative State Feminism in 1995, and its follow-up, Changing State Feminism, edited by Joyce Outshoorn and Johanna Cantola in 2007, it has produced hundreds of conference papers and articles and 5 issue books during these 15 years. The one on job training, edited by Amy Mazur, 2001, Abortion, edited by Dorothy McBride, 2001, to Prostitution, edited by Joyce Outshoorn, 2004, Political Representation, edited by Johnny Lovenzuski, 2005, and Gender in the State on Hot Issue Debates, edited by Melissa Hausman and Birgit Sauer, 2007. More than 40 researchers in 13 countries have participated in different degrees in this network. Now, the RNGS has come to its end. And here we are presenting its new capstone book. I can do it because I am not the author, and I can do this because they were a little bit ashamed of doing this. As you see, it's the politics of state feminism, innovation in comparative research, published by Temple University Press and edited by Dorothy McBride and Amy Mazur, and with the contributions by Johnny Lovenzuski, Joyce Outshoorn, Birgit Sauer, and Marilla Guadagnini. I think one of the things, okay, we'll introduce the people in the round table, but both Johnny Lovenzuski and Marilla Guadagnini couldn't come here, and I mean, we will miss them in this round table. I mean, I think we should really be especially grateful for this last effort of putting together all these 15 productive years in this wonderful book. Just let me read the very brief and sharp presentation by their authors at the beginning of the book. Just do it because it is very well organized, so I will just read this. This book is divided into 4 parts. The framework and foundation section that opens the book is followed by the research results in part 2, that is called Exploring State Feminism, which assesses theoretical propositions about state feminism, and part 3, Unpacking State Feminism, where authors consider the implications of state feminism for foundational theories of social movements, political representation, framing, and institutionalism. Part 4, Conclusion, consists of one chapter that integrates the findings and sets forth a new theory of state feminism. I mean, this is the book, but the idea of this round table is not only presenting this book. The authors want us also to discuss possible ideas for the future. What's next after RNGS? For that, although I am sure it is not completely needed, but let me introduce the 4 people in this roundtable and authors of this book. Dorothy McBride is Emeritus Professor of Political Science at Florida Atlantic University, where she was the founder of the Women's Studies program. She is the director of the or was, if we can speak in past tense of the rings, director of the Abortion Network and director of the USA team. Amy Mazur is a Johnson Distinguished Professor in the Department of Political Science in Washington State University. She is the director of job training, the Job Training Network, and the director also of the French team within the rings. Joyce Outshoorn, professor of political science also in Leiden University, is the director of the Prostitution Network and the Netherlands team. And Birgit Sauer, Austrian director of the Austrian team, which is a professor of political science at the University of Vienna. As I have already said, both Johnny Lewandowski from the Birkbeck College and Marila Guadagnini from the University of Torino cannot be here with us, but I will just pass the floor and the word for the two co-governors. Okay.
Thank you very much, Maria. We're delighted to be here, this opportunity presented here to reflect on rings and to invite all of you to participate in the discussion of what's next. We wanted to take first, though, a look back at rings. So we've prepared this PowerPoint, and it's prepared in a lighthearted vein because we know everybody's been thinking very seriously all day in all the panels and presenting papers. And now is the time to get some information, but also have a few laughs, we hope. This PowerPoint includes some very jazzy things in it, as well as videos. So the videos, you have to wait a little while we crank them up, but they're there. The general organization of this, it's fancy, it's very fancy.
Not yet, not, dancing comes later.
The dance is fancy. We thought about what were the contributions that the Rings Network has made, and by the way, we know there are many participants in the room here, so you can think we as well as looking at just Amy and me and Joyce and Birgit. There are 5 or 7 topics that we want to cover in terms of contributions. First, the rings process. Then the way we went from a model to a framework to a theory of state feminism through the Rings project. Conceptualization, we give one example of what we feel was a useful contribution in understanding for comparative analysis, women's movements and feminist movements. The integrated mixed method strategy, and then 3 contributions that state feminism theory makes. 1 to women's movement success and democratization, to women's policy agencies and their role in women's movement success, and retooling foundational theories. And for each of these topics, we have a pithy, cute little quote at the beginning, which we felt, which we've often repeated over the years, and we thought we'll bring them together. So before each one, we'll have the quote. For example, rings is addictive. This refers to the rings process. The rings process involves the network. 43 scholars, 13 country directors, 5 issue networks, 5 conveners. Sound went off?
The sound went off of here.
They heard it though, I think.
Oh, you can? Okay.
Here's a group photo from Belfast, by the way. This is the map of the country teams.
And everyone was happy the whole time, just like that.
That's the way they are.
That's the way they are, all 40 people.
Well, 13 directors anyway. Series of network meetings. We began in Leiden in 1995 and ended in Leiden in 2003. And in between, we took advantage of opportunities to collaborate at APSA, American Political Science Association, at ECPR, anywhere we could get a venue for everybody to come together. And this is a pretty impressive list of collaborative meetings, and it's probably not all of them, but these are the major ones. And we can see, if you look at this, there's a topic for each one that kind of shows the development of the collaboration as we went through the process. Collaboration in every aspect. See how thoughtful everyone
This
is.
is in Belfast. This was the Belfast meeting.
Research design, conceptualization, data collection and findings, all collaboration, and fun. Also Belfast. Belfast. Well, the first one is Leiden. The first one is Leiden in 1995. We were watching. That could be us, but we were actually watching that parade, the boat parade. It was fun. It was really fun. Don't forget the model. We started with a model in Leiden, and we developed it and went through to a state feminism framework, and then to a state feminism theory. And all the way along, Amy kept saying, don't forget the model. Well, the model comes in various forms. This is one version, one replication of it. It shows that the dependent variable was state responses to women's movement activism. The independent variables dealt with the women's movement, the policy environment. And the intervening variable, the role of women's policy agencies. That, of course, has been our focus through the RINGS project. How important are these agencies in succeeding, with women's movement succeeding within the state? There are essential RINGS building blocks. For example, the unit of analysis we decided in Leiden, 1995, not just countries, but policy debates. Oh, well, that was the video. And
Oh, no, here it is. It's there. Why can't we see it?
Dans la majorité présidentielle,
Okay, you can hear it a little
que
bit.
tous les républicains y avaient leur place.
It's the French National Assembly.
S'agissant de Monsieur
It's
Devilliers,
Sandri Mazetier being racist, but anyways, policy debate. Questions before Parliament.
mais le doute
Sorry,
était
guys.
encore permis. À l'université de l'UMP de Seignos, et depuis, malheureusement, vos ministres ont fait assaut de
But it's the
beauté
national
et de poujadisme, illustrant ce qu'est
I don't know,
aujourd'hui
we'll have to try it.
Okay,
Anyway, that's life in the big city.
policy debates. Issues, what issues to study? Not one, but 5. Abortion, job training, prostitution, political representation, and the hot issue. Scope, not the world, post-industrial democracies. And not just the 1990s when we started, but the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and the early 2000s. The RINGS definition of state feminism is an essential tool for the framework and for the the theory of state feminism, and it is that it is successful alliances of women's policy agencies and women's movement actors to achieve favorable state responses. There are research questions that came from the framework. How important is state feminism?
What conditions are favorable for state feminism and movement success?
Does state feminism make democracies more democratic?
Does state feminism vary by policy sector, country, or region?
What's feminist about state feminism? Contrasting movement state feminism and transformative state feminism.
What is the recipe for an effective women's policy agency?
The answers, a new theory of state feminism. Called the capstone analysis. You call that feminist? The other F word. Conceptualization, women's movements, and feminist movements. One of the concepts we worked hard on to conceptualize for comparative and cross-national, longitudinal, cross-issue study. It took us a while to figure this out. Now, what took so long?
We know the women's movement and feminism when we see it.
You do, but what about the rest of us?
Do we have to define it?
Yes.
Don't do this at home.
It's a research definition, not eternal truth. It took years. But we came up with the women's movement 2 fundamental dimensions: discourse and actors. The discourse, 3 essential elements: identity with women as a group, explicitly gendered language, expressing women representing women. These 3 elements are the women's movement discourse. They must all be there. And women's movement actors are individuals, informal groups, organizations that present this movement discourse in public life.
But not men, women's policy agencies, or government institutions. Sorry.
For this project. The feminist movement is a subcategory of the women's movement. And the discourse connections are shown in this diagram, where the women's movement discourse pieces are frame the feminist movement discourse, which adds to the 3 essentials 2 more. Advances the status of women to overcome inequality, a discourse that promotes equality for women and men, and the challenges gender hierarchies and forms of subordination of women. QCA, multiple conjunctural causation, I have no idea what you're talking about. It seems that everyone said that except McBride, Mazur, and Crook. Thank you, Mona Lena. It was nice
Other
to
than
have
that, no one knows it.
somebody else. Not true anymore, I've been told, but at the time, it was like, what? Integrated mixed method strategy. Rings chose not to choose between quantitative and qualitative methods in the analysis of the policy debates that we studied. And we agreed to use more than one method for a complete understanding of state feminism. A big toolbox.
A pink one.
A pink one. Right. Here are tools with some examples. The descriptive statistic. The statistical inference, ordinal regression we used. Causal mechanisms case studies. And crisp set qualitative comparative analysis, CSQCA. This is a truth table with solutions. And when you get the book and you go online to find the methodological appendices, you get to see lots of these. So it's lots of fun. Okay, mixed methods. So what difference did it make that we integrated mixed method strategy? Well, first of all, more full and accurate picture of the role and causes of women's policy activities.
Women's policy agencies play a backup role when other conditions are not favorable.
We learned the vital role of left-wing women members of parliament in relation to parties, unions, and women's movement actors.
New conditions, we also found new conditions that were not predicted by the model and framework.
We found about the limits of transformative state feminism.
And finally, we found the importance of feminist heads of agencies within the context of policy subsystems and relations with women's movement actors in previous debates.
So we move now to the 3 contributions of state feminism theory to the study of gender politics. How do you democratize a country that's already democratic? So number 1 is the findings on women's movement success and democratization. State feminism theory framework connects the rings essential typology of state response to women's movements, which basically connects into a little 2x2 table, 4 types of state response relating to the extent to which a policy content coincides with women's movement goals and the extent to which participation of women's movement actors is accomplished as a result of the debate. If we take the top quadrant of that, we see that these 2 sets of variables correspond to descriptive and substantive representation. Content, substantive; participation, descriptive. So when both are present in dual response, we have an increase in democracy in that country, at least democratic representation. Now the accumulation.
Example.
Sorry?
Example of a dual response.
Sorry, got it. Great, okay. Didn't know it was working. It's still loading.
This is an example of a dual response.
Well, there's Lily Ledbetter.
And there are other women's movement actors present at the signing of this law on equal pay.
President of the United States, accompanied by Mrs. Lily Ledbetter.
The bill that was signed into law.
Okay, that's enough.
Oh, anyway, so,
Okay.
yeah. Not
Sorry.
a debate we studied, but that's an
Yeah,
example.
not a debate.
So, to democratization, the accumulation of dual responses over time in a political system in one country means an increase in descriptive and substantive representation of women.
Keeping in mind the number of debates and issues covered vary, there are country patterns, and that means more democracy.
Our country patterns in 3 categories: high, medium, and low. And it pertains to, these are the sort of description of the patterns found in each of these categories. From 64 to 100% dual response in the debates we studied on those issues in those countries. Half in the middle, and a low 10 to 20%. And keep in mind this low group, because it's coming up a little later about the importance of women's policy agencies in these groups.
We had 130 policy debates in the final.
It says it on there too.
Oh, does it say that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. That's good. They didn't say
Femocrats, are they all like Yvette Roudy, or do they want to be? What is the role of women's policy agencies in movement success? Well, one of the contributions we think the book makes is the backup theory, an important backup when other things don't work out. These are Femocrats, or a former Femocrat in one case, I believe.
Shireen Rai is it.
And Shireen Rai studies Femocrats.
Agnes Hubert, everyone knows Agnes.
Agnes Hubert. And this actually was at the policy conference Rings did in Washington, D.C. in 2005. This was one of the panels that we had there.
Sabina Lang is a former Femocrat, for people who didn't know
Yes,
that.
so there she is, yes. She doesn't look like she's happy with what's going on there. So the backup role. Okay, here's how it goes. The greater the activity of agencies on behalf of women's movement, the better the chance of a positive response to women's movement demands.
But there are other variables and conditions often more favorable to movement success. Priority of the issue, openness of subsystems, and compatibility of movement demand with policy actor views.
Then movements can be successful regardless of what the agencies are doing.
However, when these favorable conditions are not present, effective agencies are likely to help actors overcome barriers and gain success.
The agency backup role is especially important in job training debates. This is an issue where the women's movement has a difficult time getting access to policy subsystems. And women's policy agencies may help, may actually try to promote the issues, but they can't get in either. So we found, however, that women's movement were successful on rare occasions when the policy subsystem was closed, not open to outside groups. Yet there were some successes, even in closed systems. What made the difference? Women's policy agencies inside the subsystem, the backup role, results due to USQCA. Oh, in case, oh, that's
Sorry.
the country, yes, you. The agency backup role is also important in some countries, so it's important in the issue of job training, also in some countries, especially with low overall success rates. That group that was on the right, the low, we found more importance for agencies when they did have a success. The women's movement really owed it to the agency. Causal mechanism case studies. Third contribution of state feminism theory we promote is we're out of the feminist ghetto and into the male stream. Retooling foundational theories. By deepening and broadening the analysis in the third part of the book, multi-method and state feminism findings overturn conventional wisdom in major bodies of theory. Some examples. Social movement conventional wisdom. The pattern of change of movements is in cycles or waves. They arise, they're maintained, and the inevitable decline.
Out with the cycles and waves. The women's movement is alive and kicking right into the 21st century. This is what Joyce Outshoorn said in chapter 7.
And this is her table. This is her fabulous table, which we couldn't put in color in the book. But it
shows the
evidence
yes.
of women's movement actor increase over the time. Political representation conventional wisdom. New interests won't really have influence until they reach a critical mass inside the government.
Out with critical mass. Our research reinforces our contention that is critical acts and not critical mass that determine movement success. But it also points to the need for further work that is sensitive to the interplay between actors in different institutional contexts. This is what Johnny Lowandesky and Marilla Guadagnini wrote about in chapter 8.
Framing conventional wisdom. You won't find anybody bringing real feminist ideas into policy processes. The most successful strategy is to emphasize the differences between women and men.
Out with difference framing. A majority of the frames in the debates conform to the equality and women's rights frame, 66%, while transformative feminist frames made up 19%. Only 15% were difference frames. This is what Birgit Sauer said in chapter 9. Rings never end.
Oh. But what's next? Let's discuss it. Intersectionality.
Throughout my childhood coming up, I always dealt with my black identity. It was never any question about having to deal with that. Fortunately, I grew up, around in a black community, so it was a positive experience. But at the same time, I knew that I was discriminated against when I stepped out of my world, out of my bubble. And I think probably in high school is when I came more in.
It's an African-American black feminist, sorry.
Lesbian,
Lesbian, yeah. Lesbian, right.
not black, lesbian. African-American lesbian.
Yeah, sorry. Anyway.
Agencies sometimes fall apart. How do you study it when things go wrong?
Stephen Harper is to blame. Stephen Harper is to blame. Isn't this such a shame? Isn't this such a shame? Savona, where are you? Savona, where are you? All we want is your help. All we want is your help. What we want is just what's fair. What we want is just what's fair. We demand we get our share. We demand we get our share. I don't know, but I've been told. I don't know, but I've been told. Stats of women will be closed. Stats of women will be closed.
It's a bureau in
Stephen
Canada.
Harper is
That
to
was
blame.
closed by the Harper
Stephen
Group.
Harper.
Yep.
International influences on women's policy agencies, what are they?
Oh, it's just not working.
There we go. It's not a video.
Okay, that's fine.
Well, we do have an opportunity to talk about that further, we hope, at the Women's World Conference in July 2011. We have proposed what does rings and the study of women's policy agencies, how can this be helpful or not to people studying agencies and politics outside of the Western post-industrial democracies. We have, we should find out next week if we've been approved, but the idea is an open discussion with people who are doing research and want to do research outside of the post-industrial democracies. And if your name is not, we have a big list already, but if you want your name to be sure on this list so you know about it, and we would invite you specifically to attend, please let us know. Ottawa. Is another rings possible? These are some summation of our questions, and there may be others that you want to consider in the what's next category.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, okay, thank you so much. I think they have summarized very well the at least five challenges that we can discuss, and I think we can do that. Maybe just to try to add to these already posed questions, to add something for the discussion, maybe we can say something about the point raised by Mike Verlo yesterday. Maybe we can also think on studying gender and the state and its interface with civil society, not only as a classical political process, but also as an arena for feminist struggles about what feminism is about or what it can become at a certain time and location. So maybe we can also think about that. And in that sense, I would like to propose also the possibility of opening the approaches and the strategies like in a horizontal way for studying using this idea of the mixed methods approach that the rings are working and claim, and not only in the sense of using mixed techniques and methods, but also mixing overall methodological approaches and strategies, even different paradigms and ways of approaching things. In that sense, there are some things like discursive approaches, but we can say many other things. And even this idea of the about the how to study the things when things go wrong. I just have this. We have had this this experience studying intersectionality in the southern states in Europe. And the problem is that we have found ourselves studying and doing the analysis of an absence. That's quite difficult to do. Okay, the anatomy of an absence. So we have just come to the conclusion that we really need to use more bottom-up perspective instead of top-down perspective in order to try to find when we need to find something that is not there. We have had some other interesting things in some panels about how to analyze failure instead of by Christina Bergquist and her colleagues. I mean, I think we also have a lot of that, and that's connecting. And I think, I mean, now the floor is open, and please just raise your hand, and I will.
My name is Teresa Kulawik. I'm born in Poland. I'm German citizen, and I work in Sweden. I see one absence, a big absence. You see it? Eastern Europe, post-socialist states. You have started the Project 95. How have you reflected when you started it, excluding the post-socialist democracies?
Okay, maybe we can take some other questions, and then you can react. Okay, more questions, comments?
University of Stockholm. I'm really looking forward to the book. I have this question. Do you think the state feminism is over? In the way that we used to define state feminism as women policy agencies in which women's organizations have an influence, and women's organizations are being more and more thrown out of committees and boards. And with gender mainstreaming, sometimes women policy agencies are being closed. You make, like in the Nordic countries, you have ombudsmen now for discrimination. You don't have any gender ombudsman anymore. So is state feminism's period, is it over in your perspective?
Some other question by the moment? Yeah, Raluca. Please identify yourself.
I'm Raluca Popa from Central European University. You mentioned that one of the and I think that goes a little bit along the lines of the first question. You mentioned that one of the possible ways forward that you see is applications of state feminism outside the West. I think that's what you said. But I think there is already some analysis. It's not necessarily perhaps coming from political science, but there is historical analysis. There are historians. I mean, one that comes to mind immediately is Wang Zheng. She's a Chinese, she's a scholar of China. She specifically uses the term state feminism to analyze the All China Women's Federation, for example. And I mean, a number of examples come to mind. Analysis of Nicaragua, so there is already direct engagement with this concept from other scholarship, perhaps, but also from within political science. I think the scholars that study development, well, not the best word, perhaps, but definitely I could come up with some examples. So I wonder if you mean something else that what these analyses are doing or have done. Yeah.
Okay. Johanna, and then you will answer. Okay.
Johanna Kantola from the University of Helsinki. Just kind of a, I guess, intersectionality problematizes feminism in state feminism. So I was wondering, in the context of Mike's presentation yesterday or the keynote, we had this long debate about neoliberalism and how it changes the state. So kind of challenging the state in state feminism when these women's policy agencies turn to the market instead of the state. And also not just kind of in this sense, but also we have kind of international organizations that have women's policy agencies, like the European Union, for example. So can we then talk about state feminism? I'm just kind of raising it up as another potential what's next type of question relating to the notion of the state in state feminism.
Okay, so then
I'm going to take a couple interconnected questions and then Amy and others. We studied Western post-industrial democracies because we were developing a comparative analysis, most similar systems. And we, at the time, had some scholars who were interested in that, and that's what we studied. The entire model and conceptualization, as we believe good comparative analysis should be, is focused on the research context of this study. However, we have had questions over the years. Well, why don't you study the non-West? How does this apply to South America? How does it apply to international? How does it apply to Eastern Europe? And we were, of course, so involved in the study at this time, we said, well, that's very interesting, and we want to put that on our agenda. That's why the last thing that RINGS is going to do is to bring together people to contribute to that discussion. We've been working a little bit on it and trying to think of how the definitions we use might be used in other countries, and we see that there's some very serious questions that have to be answered. But those have to be answered by people who are doing research in those contexts. So our idea is to help discuss it with people who are interested. And of course, there are already many studies that have been done, but there hasn't been a lot of bringing it together in a network or theoretically focused work, which maybe something can't be done, I don't know, but it's the kind of thing that maybe we could talk about in a session like at Ottawa. Is there some way we can get a bit more consistent research so we get information about what's actually happening with agencies in countries, and what at the present we don't have a great deal of information about it. So, and when people use state feminism in China, they mean the same thing as here? That's a very important question to think about. So absolutely, we want to help that. But our study was, and we think it's very important that you know what your research context is when you use a concept. Same thing with the women's movement measure. It works for this study. And if it's helpful to somebody else, great. But I think our argument would be you have to deal with it. What do you mean by women's movement? If you don't like this definition, find one that works for that context.
Let Birgit and Joyce respond to
and there's
some
some other
questions.
words.
Yeah.
No, because otherwise I would like to a little bit to reflect on what Johanna said and also what Drude said. I think there are a lot of challenges to state feminism, and of course that not the concept of intersectionality, I would say, but diversity politics might challenge state feminism, as you said. But on the other hand, it might be a challenge for research to look with the eye of intersectionality. So what does it mean, for instance, for agency, for diversity agencies in bringing in different civil society organizations' idea into the policy process? So I would say it's still a dual track. And I don't think that the state-in-state feminism is really challenged. Maybe the nation-state is challenged.
I mean, maybe at the conceptual level, like applying state feminism to an international organization.
Yeah, but it's still the regulative idea, I would say. And there is still this idea of regulation and of organizing societies, even on the national state level. So I still have the idea that you might apply state feminism or state, I don't know, diversity conceptual also to the international level. But we have to prove that. I don't know. It's still only an idea that maybe you fail totally with this concept then on the international level, but I would go for it still. So.
Did you want to?
Yeah. Well, to continue about the Europeanization effect, I think there's a huge field still to be researched about the effects of, for instance, Europeanization, which you first would have to define in a well-operationalized way, and to see how that is impacting national state level and what it means for changing opportunity structures for women's movements there, and also the role of women's policy agencies in mediating European regulation at the national level. We know bits of that, and we've done some of that. And in the book that you and I edited, we had that as an explicit question. But it's still under-researched, and I think that's one of the points which needs further development, and that could be a challenge for the future.
I think there's another question, comment by Nike.
Thank you. I have two questions actually, and one is a very small question, but when I saw the colorful graph of the continued life of the feminism, that I have not found in the book.
Not in color.
Because, yeah. it's much more clear this way. I'm wondering, and this is a question for Joyce, whether you could draw a similar graph for the strength and presence of women's policy agencies. Like to actually map out what Drude's concern is and whether, so this is my question to you. It's a small question, but maybe not easy to answer. Like, could you make such a same graph for the women's policy agencies? Wouldn't that be nice? Then we could also have like an indicator for that. That would be wonderful, actually, in also political sense. And the next question is a completely different one, which is connected to the last question of what next. which is a reflection on research policy. Because I think if you look at politics and gender scholarship, and I know that's what happens in the European context, and RNGS expands on that a little bit, then you see that the larger comparative endeavors that we have seen in the last 10, 20 years are either based on those people who already were in institutions and had power positions to some extent, like Greece, or that found money often at a European level to start projects with people who did not have yet such positions, such as Magic and Sensitive and Reckon and so on, who generate new lines of jobs, including people from countries that did not have yet such positions. Now, I think with the current organization of knowledge productions and the closing down of many options at the European level for this, I wonder what your ideas are about because ideally you would then like to see more fusions, collaborations across these newer projects like Reckon and Eurosphere and FEMSIP and gender race and I mean there's has been a lot of them and existing networks that are firmly rooted in universities as they are. So I wonder what is your take on that? What would be our claim on research policy or on university policy that would increase the chances for further collaboration?
Amy, do you want to react to that, or is there any other question? Because we still have 10 minutes. Is there any other question, comment? Oh, okay. So, Manuela.
Just a very small comment, because I still haven't read the book and I'm eager to read it, and I heard that there's a chapter on framing. So I was wondering whether in this new RNGS theoretical framework you are adopting the theoretical framework of discursive institutionalism, and if so, in what way? That would be interesting to know.
Okay, so maybe, I don't know if Amy, you want to say something, or maybe Birgit, or...
Birgit, do you want to
Shall I start with that?
Yeah, start with that.
Yeah.
Make a small point about that.
Yeah. In doing, Emanuela, in doing the RNGS work, so we started with the idea of gendering, that gendering is an important framing of policy issues. So this was the first thing in the RNGS project, right? I guess right from the beginning. I wasn't there right from the beginning, that's why I'm looking at them. So we had that idea that gendering is important, so framing is important for the policy process. And when I then came in and doing the RNGS research and starting to write the chapter on framing, then we got the idea that, of course, frames have to do with institutions. So this was a little bit before this discursive institutionalism was brought into the new institutionalism. So we're not working in the chapter with this discursive institutionalism, but what we do is saying that we look at policy processes and trace gender frames, and of course then non-gender frames, because we also have the effect that in some policy process, degendering and non-gendering leads to a success. So we are looking at the frames in different policy areas, in the different issues, and we try to connect them to the different actors, that means to the women's movement and to the women's policy agencies. So.
I'm just going to say chapter 10, which Amy and I co-authored. We didn't put a slide up about it, but it is looking at institutionalism and how state feminism pertains to that theory. And it turns out that our measures, because of that gendering that Birgit's talking about, we can look at change in the political system as a result of gendered policy debates. And it's connected to discursive institutionalism. I really welcome your comments on it if you get to that chapter. Or you can just go to it right away at the beginning and wade through the rest of it.
Mika's remark about the timeline and the women's policy agencies. Well, we have all the data to be able to do so. But I think there are less women policy agencies than the 78 women's movements we found plotting them. But all... Yes, we have all the data on women's policy agency, all the names, all their characteristics, their budgets, their leadership, the number of people employed. And the database is to be found on the RING's website. And it's open and accessible, so if anybody wants to do the job of plotting them, and I can tell you it's a lot of work, it can be done. And part of it is already in the book. Amy?
Yeah, chapter 3 takes our structural characteristics that we used in the RINGS project, and we actually mapped out all the agencies in the project over time. So there's there's an analysis of 75 agencies in the 17 countries over time, just the structural characteristics. But then we also mapped out the success, the relative success of women's policy agencies, and there's just a single graph of that, and that's in chapter 4. So that's in the book.
But the study did not. Women's policy agencies are not the unit of analysis. It's the policy debate. So it's only those agencies that appear in the debates that we have the data on. So it's incomplete, but it does, at least for those, if it's some kind of representative sample, it gives that at least.
But it explains theirs.
But it would be very interesting to map it over time because it's a range of huge number of institutions to look at. Yeah.
Maybe I'll say a couple of things to pick a couple of things up. The first thing is that we want to be clear about what's next phase. It doesn't involve us. RINGS is done. But we wanted to hold this meeting and have an opportunity. We felt like because we had you're absolutely correct, we ignored the rest of the world. And Dorothy said why. There are theoretical reasons for that. And actually, what's so interesting about this study is you see the evolution of the study of gender and politics over time and how it influenced us. We think, about 1995, Myra Marx-Ferret was at our original meeting, and a lot of the things were not even on our radar screen. Intersectionality wasn't on our radar screen. Just the international influences of things happening in the world were not on our radar screen. I was a traditionalist, meaning that I felt, and both Dorothy and I are traditionalists in terms of comparative analysis. We believe you got to take a mid-range approach. You have to only study the countries in a similar region and develop your research context in that. But guess what? Since then, many gender and politics scholars in a comparative perspective say you don't have to do that. In fact, we have to go outside and look at other countries and compare them. But we're very much bound by the period we did the study in. So I wanted to make that clear. And then there's lots of other, there are a lot of things that, as I said, were just not on our analytical agenda. And then and it kind of goes to the question of the future of women's policy agencies and the future of state feminism. And Jane Jensen, as I'm sure many of you know in the room, know her work, she said once, well, this is just an era, and that's over. And this project is great because you've mapped the era. It's a historical thing. People in 1,000 years will come back, hopefully, or whatever, but maybe the world won't exist, and hopefully they'll still be able to get access to our data set online. But we're archiving this data set with ICPSR, and I think that those institutions, because there is a long term, you want to think about what's happening to your data. But I disagree with Jane Jensen, which is not a surprise. Everyone knows I disagree with her a lot, but she knows that as well. I disagree because, and this gets at the question of if it's going to be lasting. Because we only study this stuff up into the early 2000s. That's really important to remember. And most of the stuff we studied, we did the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and then the hot issue, which were only 12 debates in the 2000s, 12. Mm-hmm. But I think what this shows, and Dorothy and I are writing this piece in another context, it shows the adaptability and the resilience of these organizations, because we did look at them over this huge time period, right, already. And so my answer is no, they're not going away. These are not powerful agencies. In fact, the more powerful agencies didn't always produce success. There's this whole thing, you're under-resourced. tough luck. In fact, some of the less powerful agencies created very successful things, so very high levels of success as we measured it. So I would say these are resilient, these are adaptable agencies, and they're going to morph with this. They're going to morph, and we're not going to lose gender equality. We're not going to lose the feminist presence. So they'll still be there, and also so is the women's movement. It's not going away, but what we see here is that it's got to change. Neoliberalism, the whole diversity issue, the decline of the state, the economic crisis. But these are going to change, and that means you have to study it. You have to study it. You have to figure this out. And a part of that study is what's going on outside of Western post-industrial democracies. So I just wanted to kind of add those things.
Okay. Do you want to say something else?
No, there's some more questions in the
Oh,
audience,
okay,
so I don't know if
okay.
have
We
time.
have just, okay. Quite quickly, because I don't know if we need to
Thank you for
finish.
a very nice presentation, and actually you gave me an answer almost to my question, because I was going to kind of take up the question that you asked last, is another rings possible? And I was thinking, without such devoted conveners and leaders of the groups, it isn't possible, and I was going to ask, well, will you devote 50 next years to something else? But you said no, so I'm very sorry about that. Because my question was actually, is this possible? And this takes back to what Mika said, and I think Johanna, about is in today's university such a long-term project possible? I mean, there's so much pressure in to do quick and dirty and so on, and so I'm just asking your reflections on this, because this has been a wonderful, addictive project, but also given a lot to us who participated, but this is some, and it wouldn't have been possible without you thinking big in the first hand, and also with resources to pull it through, energy and lots of excellent ideas and stuff. I will flatter you in person afterwards, but I mean,
bring it on.
Would it be possible to do it in today's academic work, 15 years project?
Okay, yeah, Melissa.
Melissa Hausman. I co-directed the Hot Issue Network with Birgit, which I think nearly killed both of us, but it was really enjoyable, and thanks so much. Yeah, and I think maybe that reflected, some of the questions about neoliberalism that people were talking about, because we tried to study it in an era of neoliberalism. But I wanted to say, yeah, it was a real privilege to be included in this project, and thank you two for starting it. And the other thing I think we should mention, as an American, they started this project, I can't remember in which order the funding came, but you started by getting money from the National Science Foundation, which usually funds huge and electoral studies. I don't think there had ever been a project like this funded by the National Science Foundation in the US. And then I know you also got the funding from, the European Science Foundation as well. So, I mean, that was pretty amazing, I think, back in the late 90s to get, policymakers even to agree that this kind of topic was something worth funding. So these gals really are groundbreakers in a lot of ways, and thank you.
I want to correct something. We did not start with a lot of money. We did have a tiny little NSF travel grant for Americans to go to Netherlands that had to do with some notion of learning science in Europe. And since nobody thought they could learn anything about physics and chemistry in Europe, they decided, well, they could learn something about social science. So we went there and learned from Joyce and all the Europeans that came. We did not have any money until the early 2000s. The reason being, well, we got a couple of grants in Europe, but the NSF came later. So I wouldn't say you have to have it all lined up to have a rings kind of network. You can start, and we were committed, and it wasn't just us, but everybody in the network, to take their university travel money if they had any, or if they didn't, they sometimes paid it their own way, to go to Paris, for example, for a meeting, to go to APSA, you're going anyway, so we'll have a meeting, you get ECPR, you go anyway. So we tended to piggyback, and then we got some money. But I wouldn't say, oh, I can't do that because we don't have a big grant, because if you care about the topic, you can probably get people to show up. Like everybody comes to this because everybody cares so much about this subject. So don't give up on the possibility.
And people should contact us if you have questions or you want to know how to do it or put it together. You know, it's not a, c'est pas sorcier. How do you say that in English? C'est pas sorcier. It's not that.
It's not witchcraft.
Yeah, it's not witchcraft. It's not, yeah,
It's not
you
rocket
can,
science or not
any
witchcraft.
one of you could do this in the room. It's not anything special. It takes the power of the group, I think. That's what really kept us going.
All
You
the
know,
fun.
and the idea.
And the idea.
Okay. So I think we need to thank you so much. Yeah.